What really happened behind the scenes of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive? How did Ukrainian soldiers manage to cross the Dnipro River in Kherson against all odds? And what does Zelensky mean exactly when he says the war has now entered a new phase? I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Let's find out. The fog of war has finally been lifted, thanks to a detailed article written by the Washington Post. They spoke with 30 senior Ukrainian and US military officials, in addition to 24 officers and regular frontline grunts, to find out the lessons learned. I think the reason troops speak to reporters is because they want people to know their stories. They want the public to know about their sacrifices and the lengths that they went to for their friends, family, and fellow soldiers. Ultimately, I think soldiers share their war experiences, so they weren't in vain. This is the US military base Grafenwehr in Germany. It's the largest American base in all of Europe at 232 square kilometers. In January 2023, this is where preparations for the Ukrainian offensive first began. Thousands of soldiers from the newly formed Ukrainian 47th Mechanized Brigade started a 2-month training course alongside US military advisors. Mykolai Melnyk was a lawyer in Ukraine prior to the invasion in 2024. He immediately quit his practice and volunteered to defend his homeland. When he volunteered for the 47th Brigade, he was a 38-year-old senior lieutenant. Melnyk gave an interview to Censor.net about his experience in the offensive. His brigade had volunteered for the most dangerous role as the tip of the spear in the attack. This breakthrough brigade was given Western equipment, including some of the 71 German Leopard main battle tanks and 109 American Bradleys. Melnyk became one of the dismounted infantry in the back hull of one of these Bradleys. But it wasn't just their vehicles. They were equipped with M16 rifles instead of Russian AK-style weapons. The stakes could not have been higher. That's why they got this premium equipment. Their mission was to cut the Russian land bridge in half and potentially retake half of the 18% of Ukrainian territory that the Russian forces still held on to. The Washington Post article outlines a number of different points of disagreement between the NATO advisors and the Ukrainian troops. The US military advisors wanted less focus on drones for recon, for instance. US officers then adjusted the training to include more drones. I have some personal insight into how these multinational training events go because I've participated in them before, so I know some of the common misunderstandings about them. These training events aren't just about US soldiers training other nationalities, although it's often described that way. In reality, it's more of a two-way transfer of knowledge between different armies. It's about stress testing different strategies and exchanging best practices. It's also about making fun of each other's MREs. Different standard operating procedures on the lower tactical level like this are common, and testing them out is part of the process. They familiarized themselves with the Western vehicles and practiced Western tactics, including combined arms warfare. In simple terms, combined arms warfare means to coordinate artillery, infantry, tanks, and air power in one simultaneous strike. Melnyk and his unit returned back to Ukraine, where they continued to train in Kharkiv. Then, in early May 2023, the 47th relocated right up to the front lines. They hid their M2 Bradley vehicles underneath trees in Zaporizhia. Here, they waited for orders to launch the attack. But Russian surveillance drones and spies likely gave away the element of surprise. There was a lot of international expectations for results on the battlefield from world leaders who had donated support. What all of this basically meant was that the element of surprise was long gone. This put them at a huge disadvantage compared to their last counteroffensive. But there was still one last major problem to solve before the battle could begin. How would they choose to distribute their forces? How risky would they choose to be? Ultimately, the decision was the result of Ukrainian, US, and British officers running 8 tabletop wargame simulations. They used a special computer simulator called Cora. The core of Cora is made up of a group of submodels that realistically reproduces the complexity of military operations through a network of connections, interactions, and relationships. That sounds like a bunch of nerd shit to me, so I'd probably love it. It can even model artillery fire for everything from individual units to battalion-level strategy. Its estimates place success at a 50-50 chance. The US military advisors, led by General Mark Milley, advised one course of action. The Americans suggested Ukrainian General Zaluzhny should dedicate a higher percentage of troops to one single point of attack at Robotyne, and leave less troops to defend elsewhere. Ukrainian General Zaluzhny, on the other hand, wanted to split the force evenly, 50-50 and conduct two small, distractionary diversion attacks further in the east. From Zaluzhny's point of view, it was difficult to accept the more risky plan because if the American plan turned out to be wrong, he would lose the vast majority of his combat power and vehicles. I recommend you check out the Washington Post article where I got a lot of this information from. It's very informative, it includes a wide range of perspectives. It does give the impression, though, that the results of the battle might have been different if only a different plan was chosen in hindsight. That is possible, but with counterfactuals, we have no way of knowing what difference it would have made, positive or negative. The top US General Mark Milley described the disagreement over planning this way. "I would not characterize the meeting as a come-to-Jesus meeting and some massive drama, go left, go right. I would say this is the normal course of business where professional leaders routinely meet to assess the situation and adjustments on the ground." The Ukrainian leadership decided to go with their plan of the 50-54 split, according to the article. Right before the offensive began, Russian forces mobilized 300,000 new recruits that year. It helped fill a lot of the gaps in their front lines. US officials declined or were unable to provide ATACMS and fighter jets ahead of the assault. So on the night of June 7, 2023, the 47th Brigade and Senior Lieutenant Melnik, in the back of one of the Bradleys, got the order to move out. According to Melnik, higher-ups in command had recently changed organization and equipment at the very last minute, which hurt the unit's cohesion. The long-awaited offensive had begun. The operational plan was to reach the village of Robotyne, 9 miles away from the staging area, within just 24 hours. This was where the first line of Russian defenses were located. Then, within 4 days according to the plan, they would control the entire community. From there, they would push forward to ultimately reclaim the town of Melitopol. This would accomplish their goal of cutting off Russia's supply lines within 3 months. The Ukrainian 9th Corps would attack alongside them. Once the defensive lines were breached, then the 10th Corps would exploit that gap to push further south. The 47th Brigade is estimated to have been about 5,000 soldiers strong. If we assume similar numbers for the other two corps, we can guess there were approximately 15,000 combat soldiers dedicated to the attack. On the other hand, estimates place Russian forces' strength at 400,000 throughout the entire Ukrainian country. It's uncertain how many of that 400,000 were dedicated to this region. So what are the various factors and conditions that might help explain why the attack did not go as planned? The first thing you need to know is the Ukrainian soldiers, who are veterans of the actual battle, were shocked by the density of Russian minefields. To give you an idea of the scale here, one Ukrainian soldier recovered a Russian map used to mark their minefields. For just that small area near Robotyne, 20,000 landmines were listed. They were placed 4 miles deep and 4 miles long. Ukraine's T-64 tanks with anti-mine rollers were used to clear a path, but the rollers were destroyed after only 1 mine hit them when they were supposed to withstand 4 hits. This is because Russian forces triple-stacked the landmines here. This supports the Post's claim that 60% of Ukraine's demining equipment was destroyed in just the first few days of the offensive. According to Melnik, the air support that was supposed to come never made it. When Ukraine's troops trained on the M2 Bradley in Germany, they drove in optimal conditions on smooth terrain, a far cry from the muddy earth that they encountered on the front. Add to that the stress of driving under fire, and it's a bad mix. Some of the transport drivers accidentally steered off the safe lane that had been cleared, and they hit stacks of Russian mines. This map shows a clear picture of why it was so difficult to advance south. There's only several main highways, 2 really, in the region that go south, one of which passes straight through the town of Robotyne on its way to Tokmak. These 2 roads heading south are narrow choke points that you have to pass through. Russian forces have encountered the same problem with their past failed attempts to advance in Vuheldar and elsewhere. As much discussion is made about what Ukraine did and didn't do, there's a huge missing piece of the puzzle. The enemy always has a say, and in this case, the enemy was waiting for them. Russia had fortified the entire front lines for a year and spent hundreds of millions of dollars constructing obstacles. Russia had a tactical advantage because they fired from an overwatch position on higher ground. This gave their anti-tank missile teams a clear line of sight and long standoff distance. When they scored hits on the vehicles, it created chaos, which led to other vehicles veering off the pre-cleared mine path, and they hit more landmines. It was hell. They attempted to advance for 4 long days. During the attack, 16 M2 Bradley IFVs were destroyed, which is about 15% of the total 109 sent. But according to Melnik, many of the Bradley vehicles were able to be recovered and fixed, and more importantly, the crew survived. Melnyk in his interview stated that when a Russian BMP-2 goes over a landmine, the entire crew dies. Ukrainian soldier Melnyk said, quote, "The only case when the Bradley did not withstand impacts was from the work of the helicopters. When the Ka-52 attack helicopters hit their column, one Bradley detonated." This is the battle where viral images of destroyed Western vehicles came from. Each day, Ukraine destroyed 10 Russian anti-tank missile systems, but they just kept being replaced. After 4 days, by June 11th, 2023, Ukrainian General Zaluzhny decided to no longer send more troops into a frontal assault. He changed up his tactics. They would instead go on foot one squad at a time. This way they could slowly clear the landmines. This process was extremely slow, but eventually did gain some results with less losses. The reason it took so long is because they had to use metal detectors by hand, and they actually had to use rope to pull the detonator. But it wasn't a perfect solution. Melnyk stepped on a landmine and lost his leg during the clearing operations. He was saved by an M2 Bradley that medevaced him. He survived, but he was out of the fight. The casualty numbers were reportedly a very high price to pay. Estimates placed the amount of wounded in KIA at a significantly high percentage of those troops. After 12 weeks of minefield clearing operations, the 47th Brigade made their first tangible progress. On September 3rd, Ukrainian forces broke through the first line of Russia's defenses. There was a moment where it appeared like they might be able to take advantage of that breach and continue pushing forward. But if the gap isn't quickly exploited, it gives defenders time to focus on refortifying the second and third lines. One of the factors outlined in the Washington Post details how 70% of the Ukrainian soldiers had never been in combat before this offensive. Personally, I don't put a lot of weight on that because there are many historical examples of inexperienced units performing well. There's a counterpoint to this too. Forbes pointed out in this report that the 47th Brigade was an all-volunteer unit, which means despite their lack of combat experience, they were highly motivated. These were the most dedicated troops who wanted to retake their homeland back from Russia. It can be more difficult to weigh these intangible aspects like morale, combat experience. The bravery and skill of individual soldiers can help tip the scales in a battle, but without proper air support, those factors can only go so far. But first, before we continue, I want to take a second to thank this episode's sponsor. The video editing and animation work in this video was sponsored by JamesAllen.com. The only way we're able to continue making this content for free is thanks to our sponsors. Personally, I recently proposed to my girlfriend Caitlin. I was lucky enough for her to have said yes. A lot of guys in the military propose to their girlfriends around the holidays. This video sponsor, JamesAllen.com, knows each love story is unique, so their goal is to make it easy to design custom engagement rings. They offer over 200,000 certified conflict-free diamonds. JamesAllen.com's store is completely online, which not only saves you up to 50% compared to traditional retailers, it also gives you an up-close 360-degree view of your diamond. Along with real-time diamond consultants, they have hundreds of ring settings in metals like platinum and rose gold, and everything comes with free resizing, engraving, and lifetime warranty. So if you're planning to ask the big question, customize your engagement ring or jewelry piece today with James Allen and get 25% off by clicking the link in the description. Ukrainian officials reported that they didn't have the air power necessary to soften up Russia's defenses. They state they couldn't use the Western fighting tactics to full effect without the air power that is foundational to it. Russian forces devoted 60% of their time and resources into building that first series of defensive positions. Ukraine believed only 20% was spent on the two subsequent defensive layers that were further south. But by September, further advances seemed impossible. Just recently, the Russian Ministry of Defense released this video of their soldiers with a captured American M2 Bradley. As far as I know, this is the first Bradley that Russian forces have been able to fully inspect. They go through the vehicle's different armor and optics systems, displaying how control panels have been replaced with Ukrainian language panels. They show where the vehicle has taken some direct hits. Some of this damage may have been from attempts by Ukraine to destroy the equipment in place, but allegedly the engine still works even after all that. In the video, the Russian media claims that the vehicle was manufactured in 2022, but that's when these Bradleys got refurbished. These were surplus vehicles from the 1980s. Laserpig had an interesting tweet about that video saying, quote, "It's kind of interesting to watch Russia simultaneously claim the superiority of their vehicles while fawning over every element of something built in the 1980s. But while that advance may have culminated, there's been recent unexpected advances in Kherson. Take a look at Ukraine's live conflict map. The light gray area on the north side is where Ukraine retook the city of Kherson. at which point Ukraine's forces were then blocked by the very same rivers that they had pinned the Russian forces against. We can see for ourselves from this map how limited the transportation routes here are, especially after the bridges were blown. But in October 2023, Ukrainian forces landed at 3 separate sites on the south side of the Dnipro River. Russian artillery and counterattacks failed to dislodge this battalion-size element. NASA firm satellite network data, which tracks infrared hotspots to warn of things like forest fires, shows combat explosions and activity here into November. So the Ukrainian forces had advanced 8 kilometers deep. What we've observed is that Ukraine has established several small bridgeheads across the river. Any Ukrainian military movements here threaten to outflank Russian forces in the region. On November 15th, the first Russian acknowledgement happened in this now deleted telegram post from Russian-appointed Governor Vladimir Saldo. How were they able to do this? Ukrainian forces have favorable higher terrain here, giving them better intelligence gathering and artillery positions. Poor weather has helped the 38th Marine Brigade to sneak small boats into hidden coves and inlets. Small commercial attack drones also contributed. If you want a deep dive on that, there's a channel, Engineer React. He goes through all of it. And could the opposition have opened this opportunity up for them? Well, according to this map, Russia has around 14 units opposing Ukraine along this segment of the Dnipro River, mostly battalion or regiment size, which sounds like a lot, but these units are likely under strength and under supported, since this was supposed to be a quiet section of the front lines. Now, it's important to note this situation is in flux and it could change any day. These forces could be pulled back across the river. So the big question remains, why would Ukraine undertake such a bold move in the first place? Reports that Russia has dedicated their elite forces to defend against the counteroffensive and their own pushes in the east means that second-rate Russian forces are located in Kherson. And so now we've observed Ukrainian amphibious transports, BTR-4s, and BMPs moving in through here, which could indicate future plans to advance here. Although there's also contradictory information that tells us that the new orders to build defensive lines here means that we're entering a new stage of the war. Now, Zelensky was referring to the fact that the war is entering its winter stage. And it appears like Ukraine is using that as an opportunity to increase their defensive fortifications, because Zelensky ordered the Ukrainian military to construct extensive defensive fortifications all along the front lines now. The new focus is to hold the Russian forces back. The new plan is to consolidate their territorial gains from their first counteroffensive. But this defensive line will be different from where the Russian forces placed theirs, and we'll get into why that is. This time of year each year, Ukraine enters the muddy season where rain and snow soften the ground and make advances very difficult. However, this weather creates favorable conditions to construct defensive fortifications. According to the Wall Street Journal, Ukraine has called on private companies and donors to get involved in a campaign to finance and build the fortifications. They're launching a brand new department with funding for around-the-clock construction. This inclusion of civilian companies into the war effort is something that both Ukraine and Russia are increasingly turning to. The first line of defensive systems will be created by the actual military soldiers who've been living at the front lines. This is because they're the most familiar with that terrain. Meanwhile, the planned second and third Ukrainian lines of defense will be the responsibility of the Infrastructure Ministry. And where will these new defensive constructions be located? According to the Ukrainian government, they're going to focus on the east and northeast of the country. Why? Because this is where Russian forces have attempted to advance for months. The reason why defenses will be created here is because if we look at the eastern Donbas region, there's a limited number of natural geographic obstacles. There's not a lot of rivers or mountain ranges to block advancing Russian forces. This means we can expect to see trench networks, concrete pillboxes go up in the Donbas. They also plan to build defenses against another possible invasion from Belarus. The new phase of the war could also refer to Ukraine's attempt to secure future funding from Western countries. Zelensky visited Washington, D.C. in the United States to make his case on December 12th. U.S. intelligence then declassified a document at the same time to help bolster this case for why funding should continue. According to the intel document, Russia's lost 315,000 soldiers either KIA or wounded since the start of the war. Russia denies that these figures are accurate. The intel report from the U.S. was given to lawmakers in an attempt to explain why funding has been effective. According to the White House, there's enough funding until sometime in January 2024. What strikes me as interesting though here is just how much both sides are doubling down on involving civilian organizations in the war. They're becoming more of a wartime economy in Russia, for instance. According to the Wall Street Journal, Russia's entire economy has started to turn into a wartime machine. Russian civilian companies are being converted into drone wartime infrastructure. For example, the Tambovsky bakery is assembling carbon frames and antennas and then packaging and sending them to the front lines. These drones are being made by civilian groups in Russia. Entire shopping centers were converted into drone manufacturing plants. This could hurt them in the long run because it diverts funds away from other institutions like education or healthcare. There were reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin in December signed a decree to increase the maximum number of servicemen in the Russian armed forces by 170,000 soldiers. That increase would be 15% to about 1.32 million combat personnel. The Institute for the Study of War explained how that number might actually be deceptive though, because it's more likely that it's just a formal recognition of Russia's end strength and not in order to immediately increase the number of Russian military personnel. So what that basically means is that when you do the math of all their recruitment volunteer drives and how many casualties they've had and people getting out each year, the net difference is adding 170,000 new troops as opposed to mobilizing new conscripts and forces. A lot of these are volunteers. Ukraine is heading into a cold winter, and it's yet to be seen how these moves made by each side will affect the results on the battlefield tomorrow. It's my goal to continue to bring you the stories of these soldiers and the actions that they take in this conflict and others. For future updates, follow me at Cappy Army on Instagram, and if you found something valuable or informative in this video, please consider taking a quick second to hit the like button so that more people can view this report. Thank you, and I'll see you again in a few days.